Hello everyone. Thank you all for watching the video. Wishing you all good health and peace. The dawn crept over the village like a whispered promise, its light soft as a breath, threading through the mist to cradle the rice fields that bowed beyond the dike. Diep stood by a sagging gate, her hands gripping a bamboo basket, its weave worn as her hopes. The air was thick with dew and the scent of wet earth, woven with the cluck of chickens and the faint rush of a stream winding through the hills. Hockey, her small dog, nudged her ankle, his frame thin but warm, his eyes bright with hunger, but even his presence couldn't ease the ache in her chest. Her past, parents gone, a childhood of want, a life of labor, clung to her, a shadow that whispered she wasn't enough. Today she'd work the fields, her hands raw with earth, and carry a gift for James, a watch bought with her sweat, a vow of love she feared she didn't deserve. As the village stirred, she wondered if her heart, like the rice she'd plant, could grow despite the weight of her doubts. She stepped onto the muddy path, her sandals sinking into the earth, each footfall a thread to a past she couldn't escape. The village was a tapestry of memory, palm roofs glinting under the sun, a market where voices bartered greens and fruit, a stream that glittered like scattered coins. She'd come here broken, a girl of 5, her parents' dust, her uncle's coins heavy with betrayal. He'd sold her, his voice sharp, and she'd lived with strangers, her name her only shield, until she'd fled, a girl of 12, her heart a drumbeat against fear. She'd built a life, a shack, a garden, a love she'd found in James, but her past lingered, a wound that pulsed when she counted her coins, her fingers trembling, her mind fogged with fears she couldn't name. Her childhood had been a cage, her uncle's house a place of want, his favor for boys alone. Girls marry, he'd said, and she'd watched her cousins study, their books a world she couldn't touch. By 9 she'd left school, her 3rd grade lessons a faint scar, letters she'd forgotten, dreams she'd buried. She'd worked, her hands raw with rice, her heart raw with want, until James had found her, his truck mired in mud, her laughter shy as she helped him push. "You're enough," he'd said, his eyes warm as the soil, and she'd believed him, her heart opening to a man who saw her, not her lack. But today as she walked to the fields, her basket heavy with a watch, 300,000 dong bought with her labor, she faltered, her past a chain that held her still, her fear a whisper that she'd fail him. The fields stretched wide, their earth soft and dark, the air heavy with the scent of buffalo and dew. Diep knelt by a plot, her hand steady as she worked, the plow's rhythm a song of labor she knew by heart. 300,000 per plot, the farmer had said, and she'd nodded, her back bent, her heart racing, knowing each coin was a step toward James, toward a life she wanted to build. The sun climbed, its heat a weight on her shoulders, and she thought of the watch, its face simple but bright, a gift she'd chosen with care, a vow of love she hoped he'd see. Hockey scampered nearby, his bark a quiet balm, and she smiled, her heart heavy, knowing her labor, her gift, was all she had to offer a man whose world was so vast. The stream glittered now, its waters catching the noon sun, a ribbon of light against the earth. Diep knelt beside it, her fingers trailing in the current, its chill grounding her thoughts. She'd stood with James here, his hand warm against hers, his voice a vow. "We'll build something," he'd said, meaning a farm, a life, and she'd nodded, her heart wide as the hills, her fear a shadow she'd pushed away. But his world was cracking, a call from John, a name she didn't know, pulling him to a meeting he couldn't explain. "I'll see you tonight," he'd said, and she'd nodded, her basket heavy with sapodillas, her heart heavier with doubt, enough for him, for his world of wealth and secrets she couldn't grasp. Her past was a weight, woven into her steps. She'd been married once, a girl of 16, to a man who saw her as less, his hands heavy, his voice sharp. She'd fled, her name her only map, and built a shack, a garden, a life where hockey's warmth was her constant. James had seen her, not as broken but as whole, and she'd dared to dream with him, to plant more than crops, to grow a future. But the coins in her hand, the watch she'd bought, were a mirror to her lack, and she'd wept, her voice soft, when she thought of his world, of companies and men like John who held power she couldn't touch. "You're enough," James had said, and she'd clung to it, her love for him a spark she wouldn't let die. James had sat in his office, his desk heavy with papers, his voice low as he spoke to a colleague. "John's in Thailand," he'd said, his eyes sharp with worry, "and he's pulling capital, every shareholder, big and small." The room had hummed, its air thick with doubt, and he'd listened, his jaw tight, as his colleague spoke of John's influence, of a plan that felt like a trap. "He's targeting us," James had said, and the words had hung, a shadow that lingered, a mystery he couldn't unravel. He'd thought of his father, of the empire they'd built, and vowed to keep it secret, to shield him from the storm. "No detectives yet," he'd said, his voice steady. "We watch, we wait, we strike when he's careless." But the doubt remained, a weight that pressed on his heart, a fear that his world and Diep's place in it could crumble. The shack glowed now, its roof patched, its yard alive with the cluck of chickens and the scamper of Hockey's paws. Diep knelt by their coop, her hands steady as she scattered feed. Their warmth a quiet balm. She'd gone to the market, her coins few but heavy, and bought the watch, its face bright against the stall's clutter. 300,000, the vendor had said, and she'd nodded, her heart racing, knowing it was more than she could spare, knowing it was less than James deserved. She'd carried it home, its weight a vow, a promise of love she hoped he'd see, and smiled, her heart heavy, knowing each coin was for him, for Hockey, for a life she was building with sweat and hope. James had met her at the market, his truck dusty, his eyes soft with surprise. "A gift?" he'd said, and she'd nodded, her cheeks hot, her hands trembling as she gave him the watch. "It's not much," she'd said, and he'd smiled, his fingers tracing its face, his voice low with love. "It's everything," he'd said, and she'd believed him, her heart lifting, her fear a shadow she'd pushed away. He'd taken her to a shop, its shelves bright with phones, and chosen one 3 million dong, a sum that made her gasp. "For you," he'd said, and she protested, her voice soft, her heart racing, knowing she didn't know how to use it, knowing she wanted to learn for him. The shop had hummed, its air cool, its lights sharp against the dusk. James had shown her the phone, its screen bright, its buttons a puzzle she fumbled. "Press here," he'd said, and she'd tried, her fingers trembling, her mind fogged with doubt. He'd called her, his voice a hum through the phone, and she'd laughed, her heart racing, knowing each touch was a step toward his world, a world she wanted to touch. "It's for learning," he'd said, "for us," and she'd nodded, her fear raw but easing, his faith a bridge to a future she couldn't see. They'd sat by a cafe, their drinks Basiccio cold and sweet, a weight in their hands, and talked, their voices soft, their love a vow that held them still. Diep had stood by a warehouse, his voice low, his eyes sharp with hate. "James's father took everything," he'd said, and his colleague had listened, his face tight, as Diep spoke of land stolen, of a childhood lost. "John's with me," he'd said, "and this withdrawal, it's just the start." The air had hummed, its weight heavy with vengeance, and Diep had smiled, his heart cold, his mind set on ruin. "No cause and effect," he'd said, "only justice." And the words had hung, a shadow that lingered, a plan that felt like a storm. He'd thought of James, of the empire he'd built, and vowed to tear it down, to make him pay for sins that weren't his own. The village carried on, its rhythm a gentle pulse, roosters crowing, a child's laughter fading into the dusk, the stream's murmur a constant hymn. Diep wandered to the shack, her basket empty, her heart full but fragile. She'd fed Hockey, his warmth a quiet balm, and thought of James, of the watch she'd given, of the phone he'd bought. "You're enough," he'd said, and she'd nodded, her tears falling, her heart lifting, his faith a bridge to a future she couldn't see. He'd spoken of a farm, of fields heavy with grain, of a life they'd build together, and she'd smiled, her heart wide as the hills, her fear a shadow she'd pushed away. "We'll try," she'd said, and he'd nodded, his eyes soft, his love a vow that held her still. The fields had been hard, their earth heavy with mud, and Diep had worked, her hands raw, her heart racing, knowing each plot was a step toward James, toward a life she wanted to build. She'd thought of the watch, of the phone, of the love they'd forged in dust and pain, and smiled, her heart heavy, knowing her labor, her gift, was all she had to offer. James had sat in his office, his mind torn between John's shadow and Diep's light, and vowed to fight, to hold his world, to keep her safe. Diep had planned, his heart cold, his mind set on ruin, and the village had hummed, its voices a chorus of Tet, of fortune she wanted to hold. Tet was coming, its lanterns aglow against the dark, a promise of fortune she wanted to hold. Diep thought of James, his laughter, his hands on her arm, his voice a balm to her wound. He'd spoken of a farm, of a life they'd build, and she'd smiled, her heart wide as the hills. But her past lingered, a chain that whispered she wasn't enough, and John's shadow, Duke's hate, were clouds over James's world. The watch on his wrist, the phone in her hand, were steps toward a future she couldn't see. And the love she gave to James to hockey was a choice she made each day. She thought of the fields, the watch she'd given, the phone he'd bought, the love that held them close. James had stood beside her, his presence a quiet strength, and she'd smiled, her heart racing, her hands still from scattering feed. "You're enough," he'd said, and she'd nodded, her fear raw but easing, his words a bridge to a future she couldn't see. The chickens clucked, their feathers bright in the dusk, and she smiled, her dream of a farm, a life with James, a spark that warmed her shack. James would come, his love a vow that held her still, but Duke's hate, John's shadow were storms she couldn't name. The games of Tieu were near, their cheers a hum she'd hear, and she thought of the market, its voices loud with hope. James had watched her, his eyes soft with pride, and she'd smiled, her heart heavy with doubt. Enough for him, for his world? She'd fed the chickens, tended hockey, and thought of the watch, the phone, her labor in the fields. James had stayed, his boots by the door, his voice low with plans. "We'll build," he'd said, and she'd nodded, her heart trembling, her eyes on the fields, their green a hope she clung to. Her past was a wound, but his faith was a balm, and she wanted to trust it, to believe it could endure the shadows. Questions lingered, soft as moonlight, heavy as earth. Would she rise or falter under her past? Would James unravel John's mystery, or lose his world to Duke's hate? Would their love, their farm stand strong, or would doubt, hers, his worlds, pull them apart? She thought of the chickens, the field she'd worked, the love that held her heart close, and James's voice, "You're enough," a vow that warmed her shack. Would their dream shine, a seed in Tet's glow, or wither under shadows too heavy? She didn't know, and the not knowing was a wound, faint but deep, that pulsed with every breath. Sleep would come later, broken by hockey's whines and the creak of the shack's walls. For now, Diep stood by the stream, the moon high, the village quiet save for its endless hymn. She thought of James, of his promise, of the love they'd forged in dust and pain. The answers weren't here, not yet. They lay beyond the hills in a dawn she couldn't see, and as she turned back to the shack, her steps steady, her soul burned, a flame that trembled but didn't die.